Tell me about what was that transition like coming straight from accounting and then at a CFO level when you haven't done FP&A, but now you're overseeing FP&A and doing other things.
I think one of the biggest things is really deeply understanding.
Today's guest is Andrea Hecht, Executive Vice President and Chief Financial Officer at CSAA Insurance Group. She was serving as a Managing Director in the insurance practice at BKD before joining CSAA. Earlier in her career, she spent 12 years at Ernst & Young serving clients in property, insurance, financial services, and manufacturing.
You know, when you're a controller, you're thinking, oh gosh, I got to set up a new allocation process. How am I going to account for these startup costs? And, oh, do I need an extra person to help support closing the books for that? Whereas from a CFO seat, I'm asking, well, how does that support the strategy? How do you think about the payback period? How does this serve our current customers and delight them and make them happy? It's just a completely different shift from tactical to strategic.
How do you help your team with what you learn now become more strategic?
I would say it's two things.
Welcome back to the Diary of a CFO Podcast, the podcast where finance leaders share the lessons, challenges, and wins that shape their careers as well as their organizations. I'm your host, Wassia Kamon, and today I'm super delighted to have with me Andrea Hecht. Andrea is the Executive Vice President and Chief Financial Officer at CSAA Insurance Group. Prior to joining the company in 2017, she was a managing director in the insurance practice at BKD LLP and spent 12 years at Ernst & Young providing accounting services to clients in property and casualty insurance, financial services, retail, and manufacturing industries. Welcome to the show, Andrea.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, you have such an amazing career. I'll say the dream career for a lot of college grad going to a public accounting in particular and saying, okay, maybe I'll do some time in public accounting and then transfer to industry and become CFO one time. And you did it. So I'm curious to hear from you. What drew you to public accounting in the first place? And was being a CFO always something you had in mind?
What I've wanted has actually very much evolved over time. And I am one of those people who just kind of, I feel like, kept falling into things a little bit. So I went to college at Ohio State between 1999 and 2003. And if you think back on that time, there was a lot of upheaval going on. You had September 11th, which was in my junior year of college. And then you had the collapse of Enron and Arthur Andersen and the subsequent economic turmoil that caused. And I initially started school with the intention I wanted to be a lawyer. I have been saying since I was 4 or 5 years old that I was going to be a lawyer, but I knew I needed a degree, an undergraduate degree, obviously, and I wanted to do something that if that path didn't work out, I would have, a solid work path going forward. So I chose business school with zero idea of what I thought I was actually going to major in. In my sophomore year, at Ohio State, I started the honors accounting program, and it's not because I intended upon majoring in accounting, but because actually one of my roommates was doing it, and I said, oh, well, this sounds like a really good opportunity. We'll see if I like it. And I actually ended up loving accounting and finance and everything to do with those subjects, and so kind of fell into the accounting thing. And then my junior year, I did what you're supposed to do in that program. I did a winter internship, and I happened to do it with EY. And I actually ended up really liking it. And I got a job offer out of it. And that was, back during a time where some of my classmates had job offers from Andersen, and they left school one day and came back the next, and they didn't have a job anymore. So I felt really, really fortunate at the time to even have an offer, Big 4/5 public accounting firm. And I was good at it. So I said, you know what, we'll put law school on hold for now. I can do that someday if I wanted to. And because I'm, I guess, a frugal accountant, I was not necessarily thrilled about incurring 3 years of graduate school student loans. And so I just ended up sticking with public accounting and loved it for a long time.
Oh, that's awesome. And so what were the things you liked in public accounting versus the thing you didn't? So as you enter now EY, what are some things you really liked overall about public accounting? And what are some of the things you just didn't, but you still went through?
I loved the variety. And I loved the people that I worked with. So when I was looking at the teams that I was on, I really enjoyed all of those people and actually ended up kind of getting a career path out of it because I ended up choosing an industry in public accounting to work in purely because I liked the team that I was on. I was 22
Wow.
at the time and didn't think I was going to work in insurance my entire career, but here I am. And so I really liked that variety. I liked how it challenged you. I felt like they expected a lot out of you, which I liked. And I liked how there was this defined career path where you were just going to keep moving up. And, I had a partner tell me once, public accounting is like being on an elevator and everyone else is taking the stairs. And so that really, really resonated with me. And, some of the things obviously that are challenging is just, managing the stress of public accounting. The hours are extremely long. And, at some point, your life becomes a little bit not your own, particularly during those busy times. And so those were, I would say, the challenges. But I felt for a long time that the positives definitely outweighed some of those negatives.
Nice. And at what point did you say that it was time for you to move on from public accounting? Because you stayed in public accounting for a while.
I moved on twice, but I came back once. And so about 4 years, and, that was one of those things where the shelf life of a public accounting is pretty short. And a lot of people leave after they've been a senior for a couple of years because they've got that experience of managing an engagement and you've done the people management thing. And so about 4 years in, I actually left and went and worked in industry in a financial SEC reporting role at a local company. And I was kind of like, oh, this is a good jump and it's better hours. You're still getting some variety of work. But what I realized is I really didn't like the monotony of the day-to-day. And I also didn't really fit in with the culture of the company that I had gone to. That constant, expectations of you, like you were expected to do a lot. And that really drove and challenged me. And so I left, I came back after 10 months. I always say too, if I hadn't done it then, I probably would have left when I was a manager, and I'm not sure I would have come back at that point. But because I kind of had that break in there 4 years in, it made me really appreciate what I had at EY and how much I liked the things that I liked. And so that's kind of what really led me to staying as long as I did. So I had been at EY for 12 years and it was really, I think, wearing on me. And I actually had been passed over for partner. And I just, I wasn't feeling that it was really the place for me anymore, but I really still liked the idea of public accounting. And I think part of it, that was really all I had ever known. And so I ended up going to BKD, which is now Forvis, and it was a smaller firm. And so it was a little bit more entrepreneurial. They were really looking at trying to grow their insurance practice. I was in Columbus, Ohio at the time, and there's a lot of insurance companies in Columbus. And so I knew a lot of people. And so they said, hey, why don't you come on over? And it was a connection that I had over the years from an industry conference that I went to every year. Wonderful mentor of mine who just retired, actually. So I was sad to see him go. But he had left PwC to head the insurance practice there. And he had been, kind of really trying to convince me to come over for a long time. And so I actually ended up leaving and going to BKD for a year. What's interesting about that is, so I had left in May, and in November, I got a text message, old boss at EY who had left EY. He had had a couple other stops, but he was the CFO of CSAA at the time. And he texted me and said, hey, you want to meet for a drink when I'm in town? I have something I want to talk to you about. And I can remember at the time thinking, oh, he's going to ask me to interview for a job and I don't want to leave. But that's what happened.
Wow. There's so many things I want to unpack here, because in both time, whether it was your transition to BKD, which is now Forvis, and then you becoming controller and then CFO where you are, it was allies that you had. It was networking. You mentioned an industry conference, a prior boss. So can you please dive a little deeper on how these relationships helped you? Because I feel like when you are in a technical field like we are, at first, yes, technical work and knowledge works. And then you have to get into those softer skills. You need to get into building those relationships. So what was it like for you? Because you seem to have worked very well for you.
A little bit of luck. I actually just read a book by Ina Garten called Be Ready When the Luck Happens. And so that title really resonated with me when I saw the book, and I was smiling every time she said it. But it was, I had a partner that I worked with quite closely for a period of time at EY. And I remember, him telling me, he was like, what do you want to do with your career? And I said, well, I think I want to be a partner. Like, this is 100% for me. This is the thing that I love to do. And he's like, you have to tell people that. I said, well, what do you mean? I'm just coming to work and I'm doing my job and I'm doing a good job and getting well rated. He's like, it's not just about that. He's like, you have to go tell people what you want, and you have to find people that are going to help you along your journey. He's like, because so much of it, the work part is only a portion. He's like, you have to find those people that are really going to help you along your way. And I would say for the person who helped me go from EY to BKD, that was just something. I saw him every year. He was in town a lot, and this man is the ultimate networker. And so I will actually give him credit for that relationship with me. But he was just a wonderful person that I gravitated towards because he was so genuine in how he wanted to help people. And so he and I just had a great rapport with each other. My second ally that I talked about, I think a lot of that was just he had worked with me very closely. He saw how hard I worked, and he knew that he needed somebody to come in and kind of, I would say, do a little bit different leadership style in that role. And so he and I had just, kind of texted a little bit over the years or ran into each other at things. And so I think it's just, going to places and being open to those connections and those relationships and fostering and nurturing those. It's hard to do because we have so much else going on in our lives. You've got your job, I've got a kid now. I didn't at the time. You've got your hobbies, you've got all those things that you want to do. And it's just one more thing, but it's such an important thing because you never know when those connections are going to help.
One thing too, when you talked about the partner, you had mentioned earlier that you were passed over for partner. Did you feel like that advice came in too late for you?
I look back now and I'm a true believer of everything happens for a reason. And if I hadn't, maybe I'd still be a partner in public accounting and I wouldn't have the life that I have now. So I didn't start my career with the aspiration of being a CFO. I think most of it was I wanted to get to the top level of whatever I was in. And so when I left, for a long time, I wanted to be a partner. And when I left public accounting, I said, well, what's that equivalent? But that's just pure ambition. And I think, a little bit of hubris probably. I actually ended up really liking my current job and my role, I think a little bit more by luck than by engineering.
That's amazing. I love it. And when you say now you're in corporate, so the first time you went to industry, right? You didn't like it. But then the second time, you obviously liked it because you went from controller to CFO. So what changed in between, do you think? And what may be something you had to unlearn when you left public accounting?
Yeah, I think the differences between the two times are twofold. Obviously it's a very different level and it's a very different position than being, a senior analyst in something versus being the controller. But I think more than anything, and I've learned this as I've progressed in my career, it's very much less about the work and more about the culture. And I can remember, and for me, coming to CSAA was a move. I had to move from Ohio to California, which is a big move. And I was single at the time. And so it can be a little daunting thinking about just that whole thing. And I remember when I first interviewed for the controller position, first of all, I didn't think I'd get it. And then second of all, I didn't think I'd move if I got it. But I thought, you only get so many opportunities to go through this type of interview process, which anytime, you get to go through an interview process at a C-suite level, those are good experiences to have. And maybe they'll help you later on. And, I said, oh, what's the worst thing that can happen? You get it and you say no. And so, but I remember walking through the doors at CSAA and the culture was just so strong and it was just so welcoming and inclusive, and it just resonated with me. And that to this day is why I still work here. And so I think, more seasoned Andrea in her career, I don't want to say older, but more seasoned, recognizes the importance of culture and how that makes you feel when you're at work versus maybe, 25-year-old Andrea who was just blind ambition. I think it was both of those things. It was the right role, but it was the right company too.
But I like what you said about interviewing at the VP C-suite level. It's quite different than at the senior level, because I didn't realize it was the case, like probably many people, because the kind of questions you are asked and how you answer really makes a difference. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
It's interesting, when you are interviewing at those higher levels too, first of all, you're going through what's typically a very established recruiting firm, external recruiting firm. And these people are completely different than, interviewing for an entry level position. When I interviewed for the controller position, a lot of the things were tilted towards, I obviously needed the technical expertise, but they were looking for a very specific type of leader. And so there was a lot of probing questions with that. It was a little bit eye-popping to me when I actually interviewed for the CFO position, because I was going from a very technical role and very tactical role to a much more strategic thinking role, which I hadn't necessarily had to flex that muscle as much. And so going through that process and hearing, tell me what you think about the company's strategy, and really probing on that and how finance was going to support all of those things. That was just a completely different experience for me. And I think really got me in the right mindset to take on the position when I got it.
Yes, definitely that, because moving from controller to CFO seems like a small step on someone's resumes. How to position yourself better, because a lot of controllers are stuck because it feels like it's the natural next step. Of course, they're going to take me. And then they pose a position and you're like, what the heck? I have to fight for this?
I think one of the biggest things is really deeply understanding the business and competitive landscape that you're in, and thinking about how linked finance is with strategy. It's funny, I actually earlier this week, we do a mid-year check-in with all of our leaders in the company. So we've got around 300 people, and we're talking about how things are going when we're halfway through the year. And I literally started my presentation, which was the last one, by saying, I always talk to you about how inextricably linked strategy and finance are, because if they're not, both will fail. You'll either have bad financial results because you don't have that finance lens on the strategy, or you could have okay financial results, but they're not supporting the strategic pillars of the company. And so I think when you are taking on that change in level, you really have to everything's got to be guided by strategy and strategic thinking. And I think that's daunting to some people. And I don't know if I really necessarily had that skill set when I first took over the role as CFO, but I think it's something that everybody can actually develop. It's just a different way of looking at things, and having those strategic pillars of your company really be the guiding principle for the decisions that you make. I think the other thing, when I look at the leap from controller to CFO, that you've got to be so focused on is, you at some level have to be a subject matter expert. I'm using that term loosely because you're never going to be as skilled as your peers at that level, but you have to know enough to be able to either question or support your peers that are heading up product or IT or whatever it is. You've got to be able to challenge people and get them thinking about things from the financial lens. And so if I don't have at least a basic understanding of underwriting, or the differences between how the cost support structure for a cloud-based product at IT versus on-prem, if you don't understand those things, you're not going to be able to truly help facilitate good business outcomes. And so I always tell everybody below me, and I always tell any of the younger people I talk to, like, it's so important to be so curious about what other people are doing, but also don't just accept decisions, ask why, even if it's a decision that you agree with, because it'll help you at least hear the thought process behind what happened, and it'll help you really apply that and understand how it's linked to a strategy.
I think when I was controller, I interviewed for a VP role, and I went in and I thought I aced the interview, but then the recruiter was like, Wassia, they didn't really hear the strategic portion of what you said. So I'm going to ask you, because you've been a controller and a CFO. So when marketing comes in and say, we're going to have a new product line, as a controller, how would you think about it? And as a CFO, how do you think about these kind of things now?
Oh, that's a great question. When you're a controller, you're thinking, I got to set up a new allocation process, and I'm going to have to maybe set up new reporting. And how am I going to account for these startup costs? And, do I need an extra person to help support closing the books for that? Whereas from a CFO seat, how does that support the strategy? How do you think about the payback period? How does this serve our current customers and delight them and make them happy? How is this going to improve our retention with our current customers? It's just a completely different shift from tactical to strategic. It's funny now, what resonated with me, I can remember when I was the controller, I always laugh and I say accounting and FP&A tend to fight like cats and dogs a little bit. Like they're not necessarily the happiest of marriages at every company. Although I will say I think my departments work together pretty well. But I can remember the head of FP&A at the time when I was the controller told me, he's like, well, the accountants look backwards and the finance people look in the future. And I was offended. I was like, well, aren't you just so special? But to some extent, he's right. He was right. And, that was a little bit of a mind shift for me. You get so caught up in you got to close the books every month, and then you're dealing with an audit or another compliance issue, and you've got this set schedule every single month that you're very focused on delivering. And I think it's kind of getting out of that mindset and really getting more deeply steeped in the business.
Nice. And thank you so much for sharing that, because I'm always curious, right? Because I did controllership, then I did FP&A. And so I felt like it was easier to become a CFO for me. But you went from controller and you headed FP&A. So please tell me more about what was that transition like coming straight from accounting and then at a CFO level when you haven't done FP&A, but now you're overseeing FP&A and doing other things.
I'm not sure I recommend it necessarily. I do think that if you have the chance to do both, you will certainly be much better skilled. And this is where probably spending 12 or 13 years in public accounting helped, because I could pick things up quickly. I was also extremely benefited from having somebody who had been in the FP&A role for a very long time, knew each other and respected each other. And he helped me a lot. I learned a lot from him. But I think, one of the things we have a tendency to do sometimes is to not admit when we don't know something. And that can be one of the biggest mistakes you can do, especially when you're transitioning from that controller to CFO level, because there's going to be a lot of stuff you don't know. Just like when I walked in from public accounting to being a controller, I had never closed books. I had just written memos and done auditing and, things of that nature. And so you have to be comfortable enough to admit what you don't know.
It takes a bit of being vulnerable, right? So when you crossed again from audit to controllership, like you said, I feel like when you're coming from public accounting, people used to listen to you. And then when you're an insider, it's like, no. What surprised you most on being on the other side of the audit when you were a controller, now dealing with auditors?
I'm going to be universally hated by all auditors when I say this, but I've said it multiple times. The things that I very deeply cared about at EY didn't even cross my mind. And it's, you got all your forms to fill out. And, we were going through, a lot of my career was going through the results of PCAOB audits, and you get those things pushed down to you at the firm, and they're all really important things, but they're not necessarily, when you get into the other side of the aisle, the things that keep you up at night. They are not those things. And so it was interesting to me just how much none of those things actually crossed into my day-to-day life as much. And then the other thing that just kind of blew me away, I mean, I'd only ever worked in public accounting, basically. I had 10 months elsewhere, but that was early on, and I think I had forgotten what that experience was like. I can remember like popping my head out of my office at 5:30 or 6, and I was the last one left. And I was
Yes.
like, oh, this is what they mean when they talk about work-life balance. You actually leave and you go do other things. I was like, I better go find some hobbies.
Nice. Nice. That's definitely some perks there. And I like what you said, the kind of things that keep you up at night when you're in audit are different than when you're a controller, but also when you're a controller versus a CFO. So what would you say are those different things? What keeps you up at night when you're a CFO versus what keeps you at night when you're a controller?
If we found an issue, something like that's going to keep me up at night, an error that we made working through a big complex transaction and thinking about how we're going to account for it. As CFO, I feel deeply responsible for the 4,000 people that work in my company and our almost 3 million policyholders. And so that's really what keeps me up at night at the 10,000 foot level. I'm thinking about capital, how we're deploying capital, how can we serve more AAA members. I'm thinking about expense structure and how the decisions that I make are going to affect our employees. And so I would say it's a little bit heavier burden. It's really interesting work that really delights me. I enjoy it, but it can be a little mentally tiring at times for sure.
Oh yeah, I'm feeling it. I mean, I'm in my year one of being a CFO, so curious to hear what's your good habit or routine to stay sharp or, keep your insanity, however you want to.
I love traveling. When I started this job, when I moved to California, I was single and didn't have a family. I'm now married with a 4-year-old, so there's no putting him off. He doesn't understand and he doesn't care. For me, I like working out. It helps me get good mental clarity and it's some time for myself. And, that's something we really talk about with our employees is making sure that you're taking care of yourself mentally and physically. So that's something I definitely try to focus on every day. Like I said, I love traveling. We like to cook. So there's all sorts of, you just have to kind of leave it behind and go do those things that bring you joy. But yeah, the 4-year-old will definitely, he'll snap you right out of it.
Yeah, I remember those days. My kids are 11 and 10, but yes, at that age, work-life balance is imposed. It's like,
Exactly. That's right. I like that. I'm going to use that.
because you had such amazing transitions, right? From audit to controller to then CFO. How do you help your team with what you learn now become more strategic? Because I feel like it's easier when everyone, whether it's in accounting or FP&A, wherever, think more strategically so the burden doesn't just stay on the CFO's shoulders.
Yeah, I would say it's two things. So I'm one of those people, and try as I might, you know what I'm thinking when you see the look on my face. So I'm not somebody who's going to be that way and then stand up and not be super direct about why we made decisions or how I feel about something. I try to be very honest and forthcoming with people. But also, I think one of the things I've really focused on in my, I guess it's 4.5 years now in this role, is that I took for granted, in finance and accounting, we really understand financial statements. And that's like, well, thank you. That's super obvious, Andrea. But we take for granted how easy that comes to us and how much we actually understand it. And so I really try to drive it into people, to some extent, all 4,000 people that work here, how the decisions that they make every day are tied to our financial statements and how that impacts our members, our policyholders, and them. And even if it's just like the most baseline understanding, I mean, one of the things we talk about the most in the insurance industry is our combined ratio. It's the health of our insurance operations. I just assumed when I started, everybody knew what that was, and they didn't. And obviously people at the higher levels understand it, but people a few levels down may not. And so, they would do something. I would say, well, why'd you do that? And they would explain it to me. I said, well, you understand, like, this is how it kind of manifests itself in the financial statements. And they would say, I have no idea. And so
Wow.
really trying to to drive in that financial acumen into people is something that I've really, really focused on. And I think never ending journey, but I think it helps. And I think everybody's better off for it.
Oh, definitely. And also means that you somewhere along the line have to learn to translate. No, we say accrual, we say those things that are easier for us to say in finance and accounting, but not necessarily for our business partners. So I'm curious to hear, how do you get even your accounting and FP&A team to work better together, right? Because like you said earlier, one is looking backwards, the other one is here, but we also use different technical terms, and we're also driven by different deadlines or reporting. So how do you even get your internal team to get that point of being strategic and working better together?
Yeah, I'm really fortunate. I have a pretty strategic controller right now, but I would say it was interesting, and I hope neither of them listen to this. So I have obviously vacated my role, so I had a new controller, and he was an internal promotion. And then about a year into my tenure as CFO during the height of the pandemic, and we had offered an early retirement program through the company. And we had actually turned over almost half of accounting and almost half of FP&A, including the head of FP&A. So I had a new head of FP&A coming in, and she was an external hire. And so those two did not necessarily get along, I would say, right out of the gates. But it was being very direct with strong expectations that this is how it's going to be and you will figure it out. And there's obviously always some bumps along the road. I think one of the nice things is that in FP&A, we have a couple people that have deep accounting backgrounds, like they're, reformed accountants almost, and they're CPAs. So these people actually really, really deeply understand accounting. And then we've kind of tried to bounce some FP&A people over to accounting where we can. And so I think if you've got some opportunities to have that skill set cross over, and those people can kind of help bring it back to the teams and say, well, they're going to be concerned about this, or, the accountants are going to care about that. I know you don't. I think that helps a lot. I spend most of my time now dealing with more FP&A like topics, but obviously still very much speak accounting. Clearly, I'm still a CPA. And so I think it's helpful, as a CFO, if you don't have that accounting background, it's going to be really, really challenging for you. And so I think at some levels, it's just really ensuring that everyone's aligned and that you have some people who have hopefully done both.
Speaks so well to, as a CFO, you cannot do it all. You can only do so much, right? And so I love your idea of cross training so everyone understand what's going on in the other function and have more empathy.
Empathy, a term not used by many finance people, but an important term.
What would you say, especially when we hear about AI and all the things that can happen and you feel like the world is crumbling at any point? You've gone through, like you said, in undergrad, there was 9/11, there was the Enron collapse and Big Five becoming Big Four. So if you've seen in your lifetime crisis and chaos, what would you say are some things that we should stop worrying about or maybe start focusing on more as we hear about AI and what's going on now?
That's a great question. It's interesting because I can remember when I first started at CSAA, one of the big things was autonomous vehicles are coming and they will be here by 2024, 2025. We're going to lose a ton of our revenue because we write a lot of auto insurance and, theoretically these cars will be safer. We have to replace that revenue. We were actually successful in replacing the revenue and growing, but, I don't know about you. I'm not getting into my autonomous car when I drive to work in the mornings, although I have done Waymo in San Francisco and it is actually really fun if you've never done it. It's
No, I saw it, but not me.
Oh, you got to try it. It's a great experience. And so, no matter where you are or at a point in time, there's always going to be something that's coming. And so you can worry about it or you can figure out how to embrace it and figure out the way that it works for you. When I think about Gen AI, I'm excited about the opportunities, and I don't think it's going to replace jobs per se. I think it's actually just going to make people have more time to focus on the things that matter. I think from my seat right now, what I'm trying to do is kind of wrangle people in and say, you probably shouldn't buy like 50 different tools, or, like not every Gen AI project is worth following. And so it's really focusing people on the places where you're going to get the biggest ROI on your investment. You never want to be the CFO that says we shouldn't do that. And then it comes and it's like everyone else adopts it and suddenly you're behind. But I think it's from my seat, I'm trying to get people to think about, how are your people going to use this? How is this going to make them more effective and efficient? How does Gen AI support our 4 strategic pillars? Like, where are we going to get the most return and still be responsible with its usage? No one's figured it out. It's definitely a push-pull, but I think people just, when you see something like that, you get this like, oh, am I behind? Am I behind? And I want to rush to catch up. And it's like, I don't think anybody is necessarily behind at this point. I think we're all kind of starting down the path, but we got to figure out how to do it responsibly and in places where it makes the most sense.
It was so eye-opening when you talked about autonomous vehicle and what it means in your industry. So definitely want to take a little more time to dive into what does it mean if we have cars that are driving themselves and you are a auto insurer.
Yeah. I mean, cars are still going to need insurance. There's still going to be accidents. It's the question of, are they safer, which I think they are. Obviously, if you look at cars of today, they're much safer than cars of yesterday. I, as the cheap, frugal accountant, finally gave up, my car that was a 2013 about 8 months ago and finally got a new car.
You have my 2014.
Well, the funny thing, I don't drive that much. And so I was like, okay, I'm finally going to bite the bullet. But I'm looking at this new car that I bought and it's an all electric and it's got all these cameras on it. And I'm like, God, this is amazing. Like, how did I live without this thing? Right. But then, of course, the insurance person in me looks at it and says, but oh my God, if somebody like, a fender bender, my old 2013 would be a lot cheaper to fix. And obviously, like, I know that because I see costs associated with things. No matter what, there's always going to be auto insurance. At some point, we'll have the flying cars in the future. Everybody will be in a Waymo, but, that time is far from now. And it's something that we're still thinking about. From my seat, much more focused on is, we're a California homeowners company. And so we are deeply concerned about, wildfire and how do you manage capital in the home business. And, I think no matter where you live, if you are an insurance company that writes homeowners insurance, you're concerned about, big catastrophes that could happen in your book. So, we're kind of embracing the autonomous vehicle thing. We have a commercial auto arm called Mobilitas, and we are deep in that mobility space. And so part of that is focusing on, the companies that write or that have that type of business. But I think, my singular biggest concern is just balancing, still have a really healthy, strong capital base for our company.
Thank you so much for sharing. That was so, so helpful. My last question for you. I know you mentioned traveling, but what's your favorite thing to do outside of work? Like, if I was catching you, you were off day, where would I find you?
I'm one of those people, obnoxious Californian, in that I love to be outside. And so when I moved, I went from Ohio and never hiking. And, there's lots of great things about every part of this country, but, we don't exactly have like mountains to climb or, waterfalls to see. And so when I moved to California, I saw the cost of living here versus where I was at. I said, okay, you're going to make this worth what you're paying. And so my boss jokes with me because he's lived in California since college. So he's been here a long time. He's like, I've never seen somebody get around California like you do. And I was like, it's not worth living here. We are always outside. It is a beautiful state. I love the Western United States. So we're actually on a quest right now. I want to get my all 63 national parks before he's 18. That's like a big focus of our trip and spending that time together as a family outdoors.
Thank you so much for being on the show, Andrea. It was such a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you so much for having me.
And that's it for today's episode of the Diary of a CFO. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to like, review, subscribe, and share with others. Our website is thediaryofacfo.com. That's where you can find all the episodes, access all the guest profiles, see their bios and their social media links. It is also the place where you can apply to be a guest on the podcast and have information about how you can sponsor the show. As always, if there is any topic you would like me to cover in the future, just email me at ask@thediaryofacfo.com. See you soon.
Wondering if you're ready for the CFO role? Find out with a free CFO readiness scorecard at cfo.scoreapp.com.